of having recording in progress, having the speaker, Nomon Tim from Bellingham, a wonderful teacher and speaker. Some more information. He began practicing in 1983 as a university student in Japan with Rinzai priest.
You're reading somebody else's bio,
I'm
I think.
reading somebody else. I'm so sorry. I grabbed
That's okay.
the wrong one.
I did start
Oh,
about them, but not in Japan.
exactly. That sounded so familiar and so wrong.
Sounds like
Now,
my friend Michael.
it is.
Ah,
And now I've lost Zoom. Hang on one second. There we go. So I'm going to stop now and ask Tim to introduce himself because clearly he knows better than I do the details, although he is from Bellingham
that's true.
and his last name is Burnett. So Tim,
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you, Steve. And nice to remember that I know Kirk. And Stephen, you're familiar to me from the class with Grace. Yeah, nice to see you. And maybe other folks I've somehow bumped into over the years. It's not such a large world. I was kind of counting on Steve just to read a script and I wouldn't have to think about myself too much, but yeah, similar to my friend Michael, he must have visited recently if he's on the front of Steve's screen. But I started in the 80s, touched into Zen a little bit in high school. I was in an alternative program, so we visited ashrams and a zendo. And in college, there was a place, and I just kind of kept at it. I didn't know what it was about or why I liked it. I'm not sure if I even liked it, actually, but something in it was fed me and helped me, and I felt better and felt more able to cope with my life. I was very shy, kind of insecure, a young man, and the days felt better if I went to Zazen. I didn't know why. I didn't tell anybody for years. Nobody. It was a secret, I did this thing. And anyway, I don't want to go on too long. Residential training at Green Gulch Farm early and connected with who ended up becoming my teacher from then to now, Norman Fisher. And life and career brought me to Washington State from California. I grew up in mostly the Bay Area, so Zen hotbed, I guess. And I'll tell one Zen story from that time, which is I went to see Norman figuring that was it. I never assumed you could keep this up without the support of a center, and I was at impressive big centers, and nothing was up here that I knew about. But by the weirdest coincidence, he tells me, oh, I'm being invited to teach in the Northwest by this other group up across the border from where you'll be in Vancouver, the group that became the group that Michael Newton is now leading. And so, yeah, Norman was very determined, and we realized later we created a good way for him to train as a teacher. We provided the students, and we were really grateful. He came up many times a year for a decade, and gradually the sanghas north and south of the border, Bellingham and Vancouver, BC, grew. And through stumbles and joys and lots of learning along the way, we grew and as individuals and as sanghas. To the point to which we managed a couple of years ago to raise way more money than I could have imagined and buy a building and just finished a big renovation of an office building as a temple. So now we have a temple in Bellingham, Washington. I hope you'll come visit sometime. Uh, just practiced there this morning and came out beautiful. And now that we own a building, we're worried about money, but that's just how that goes. You guys are smart. Yeah, you only have to pay the Zoom bill. Everything is fine from there. Huh? No problems. And I don't understand why all this works the way it does, but I do enjoy study, and I thought I'd share a few stories from the Zen annals this afternoon. uh, but somehow, for those of us for whom it's helpful, it's just so transformational, right? So supportive, and being a so-called teacher of it is even more mysterious to me. I just feel like I'm just kind of like trying to keep my life together, and sometimes people want to talk to me, and sometimes what I say really seems to help them, and I'm like, wow, cool. And if I try too hard, it doesn't work out as well. So that's enough about me, I think. Oh, you want the other stats? Maybe ordained in 2000 and transmitted in 2011, with Norman Fisher. He has some good books if you haven't run into him. And then you guys do the talk and then Zazen, right? Should I just give a talk? Okay. All right. And I'm instructed to be brief, which is not my normal mode. Maybe you already noticed. So I shall endeavor to stick to my plan. Okay. But then we have discussion later, so that's great. I feel good. uh, just about echoed you, Steve. I just about started giving the talk that I gave to the other, to our group. Only would be fair, right, to give the wrong talk after receiving the wrong introduction. It all goes together. Anyway, so I thought it'd be fun to share some Zen family stories. And this is a little bit like hanging out with our families over the holidays, which we just did, some of us. And hearing yet again about Ken's misadventures or Great Aunt Maud's dog or something like that. And those stories that are told over and over again. So they must have some juice to them that they're still told. Must be somehow worth telling. And they probably change a little bit every time they're told. And so we have stories from Zen families just like that. We know from the Buddhist scholars that probably, just like Uncle Ken's story, which really happened to Uncle Ralph or some other person, probably most of the stories didn't exactly happen to that historical person in exactly that way, and the exact words that are said by whom to who are unrecoverable. But we have these specific stories written in Chinese that are just such delights and treasures. And so the part of me that went to college and was trained in scholastic rigor and all that stuff always wants to give this little disclaimer, but that it would be not necessarily honest to say, I want to tell you about so-and-so who said such and so. Like, well, maybe. Most of these historical personages we think did exist, but part of what Zen does, like politicians do too, I guess, is make use of the previous greats to sell the current program, so they got to get a little embroidered and rejiggered to suit other purposes later. But I think there's always still some deep wisdom in these stories, regardless of exactly who said what to who. And in fact, on the sort of historicity of things, I want to recommend to you, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, Buddhist studies kind of stuff, a great scholar named John McRae. He's passed now, American scholar, and he has a great book called Seeing Through Zen. And in there he says, well, one of the rules of Zen studies is the great stories are not true, and that's why they're the most important. So, or the other way around. If it seems the most important, it's probably not true. So it's holding those opposites in a way. So anyway, who cares? They're just stories. So I thought I'd focus just on one figure from the great Tang dynasty in China, which is kind of the origin time of our schools of Zen today, mostly embroidered by later later monks, of course. And the person I thought we'd talk about is named Zhao Zhou in Chinese. Two-character name, Zhao and Zhou, something like that. The Chinese pronounce these two characters Zhou Shu, so you may have heard this person called Zhou. And confusingly, when you're reading this stuff on the page, his Chinese name Zhao Zhou is sometimes spelled with a C and sometimes with a Z, like zebra, because there's different systems for converting the Chinese into some semblance in English, which probably butcher pretty badly. So there's at least 3 different looking names for this one person. So that's one of the challenges of studying the Zen greats. They have all these different names, and there's more beyond that, which we'll touch on in a minute. So Zhao Zhou was born at the very end of the 8th century, and there are many Zen stories and formally retold Zen koans, which are, a special category of Zen story from back then, that feature him. And the most famous one, probably the most famous of all the koans, is this classic, case number 1 of the Gateless Barrier koan collection. Very short. A monk asked Jiaozhou, our teacher, "Does a dog have Buddha nature or not?" Jiaozhou answered, "Not." End of story. I think it's 15 characters in Chinese. And this not, or you could say no, you could also have them say no, we're translating, is the famous character called mu by the Japanese Zenis, or wu in Chinese. And it's a really beautiful character, actually. I meant to organize a screen share, but I didn't pull it off. It kind of looks like a gate, big, strong gate, lots of horizontal and vertical lines. And you look at that and you're like, yeah, that's no. No way I'm getting through that thing. But it's a very strange little story, right? Because it makes no sense. Right? Well, we all know that everything has Buddha nature. So why would this monk even ask this question? It's kind of like a dumb question. And how come Jiaozhou didn't just sort of give him a little slap and say, "Doe, why are you asking that?" But instead, somehow Jiaozhou turned the whole situation by negating the obvious thing, saying the opposite of what we might expect. And this kicked off thousands of years of study, Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah, in the chat is character mu in small. You got to see it big in calligraphy and stuff, though, too. It's really dramatic, and there's lots of ways to do it. And so it's just a little more about that, but the important thing is that this is the teacher who did that little nifty trick. And this koan, has been treasured ever since, Very strange. But it's also a kind of points to an interesting quality of these Zen stories, and the origin for all of us, all of what we're doing, the origin texts are all in Chinese. Most of the Southeast Asia, or the East Asian cultures adapted and adopted Chinese in various ways and venerated the Chinese culture as high culture. So that's what the teachings were written down in, and that's what they were studied in Japan. It's studied in Chinese, although more stuff about pronunciation. The Japanese came up with different ways of saying them than the Chinese, and the Japanese monks couldn't really speak Chinese, but they found they had a way of reading these characters. Thus, mu versus wu, and joshu versus jiaozhou, different ways of reading the same characters. But one of the things that's really stark about this particular story is the use of a really ordinary word, it's the everyday word for no, or not, You'd use that to say, no money, or, no train, or whatever, You'd use that same character. There's another one, too, that means a little bit different, like we have no and not and stuff. And so somehow this simple word, mu, opens up a whole universe, when you really sit with it and breathe with it. And it's the reason it's number 1 in that one of the most famous koan collections, the Gateless Gate koan collection, is the teacher who compiled that clearly treasured it and talked about it at length in his introduction to the whole book, that this is the place to start. With great intensity and great energy and great fervor, you should study this no, this mu, this woo. And koans, get kind of a bad rap as sort of anti-intellectual puzzles, and that's not it. It's more like, here's a story to remind us, to remind us not to settle for our ordinary sort of concept-driven, dualistic, this, that, bigger, smaller, me, you way of looking at reality, so bound by our concepts and so caught in our vision of who we think we are. They're kind of designed, and you use your mind to work with them too. It's not against the mind, but they're kind of designed to encourage us to take a broader, deeper, maybe softer view, to look at the space in between the negations, to hold both sides of everything together, to just let ourselves swim in the true kaleidoscope of reality in a deeper way. They really do kind of do that. Many of you have experienced this, I'm sure. And they can also be confusing and annoying, and and all that, Like, what's this about? And those can be a lot of fun, And I think that's another thing that's great about them. We're so serious about getting the right answer. And, in formal Koan studies, there are acceptable responses for sure, and different systems are more or less flexible about what those can be, but it's not exactly an answer to any of this, right? Is there an answer to who you are or what life is? Not really, right? Which is why life is wonderful, right? So Zen encourages that kind of point of view. Everything's great because we don't know, right? Because we don't know. And actually, it's not just no. Anyway, it turns out. Did you know there's a longer version of this story about the dog and Buddha nature? It's in the Book of Serenity, number 18. This one goes like this. Just like Uncle Ralph's stories, right? There's many different versions. A monk asked Jiao, does the dog have Buddha nature or not? Jiao said, yes. The monk said, since it has, why is it then in this skin bag? Jiao replied, because the dog knows, yet deliberately transgresses. Another monk asked Jiao, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Jiao said, no. We're back there. The monk said, but all sentient beings have Buddha nature. Why does a dog have none? Jiao said, because the dog still has impulsive consciousness. So it's yes and no. With some little explanatory phrases to explore and ponder and unpack, but we'll do that another time. This is all Master Jiao. The story of Jiao's career is fun. In brief, as I mentioned, he was born at the end of the 9th century, ordained as a young man, as many of them did, and we are talking here mostly about men, sadly. I'm sure you're also studying the great women ancestors. And Jiao, as a young man through a middle-aged person into the beginnings of old age, stayed in the same place, studying for a very long time with his one main teacher named Nanchuan, about whom there are also many famous stories. Maybe you've heard the kind of gruesome-sounding one about cutting a cat in two. Yeah. And then Jiao, at the age of either 60 or 80, depending on the telling, decided he was ready to go further than the 4 walls of this monastery where he'd just been for 50-something years. To do a kind of standard move for a seasoned Chan Zen monk, hit the road, visit other teachers, go to other monasteries and temples, see what else you have to learn. Maybe if you're an aggressive kind of person, to test your understanding. They use that kind of language, go test your understanding. And Jiao famously said something about his intention before setting off on this pilgrimage. It's kind of like, Zen finishing school. You're in the monastery for a long time, and then you go on a pilgrimage. He had a statement of intention about how open and curious and willing to show up he was going to be during his pilgrimage. He said, if a 7-year-old child surpasses me, I will ask them for instruction. If a 100-year-old man does not measure up to me, I will teach him. Isn't that great, Humble and open, this kid has something for me to learn, I'll listen. And willing to show up and lend a hand and offer the Dharma. Oh, maybe I can offer you some teaching, even though you're old, And then, after 20 years of pilgrimage, the stories go, imagine that, wandering the dusty roads for 20 years from temple to temple. He settled down. He found a kind of unused, broken down temple and lived out his days as a temple priest, passing at the ripe old age of 120. Really modest place, just a few students. He didn't set himself up to be the abbot of a big monastery, which presumably he could have done. And while there at this temple, Guanyin Temple it's called, my favorite Jiao story happened. This one retold as Koan number 52 in the Blue Cliff Records. So we've touched on 3 of the major collections already. So here's the story from the Blue Cliff Record. A monk asked Jiaozhou, "For a long time I've heard of the stone bridge of Jiaozhou, but now that I've come here, I just see a simple log bridge." Jiaozhou said, "You just see the log bridge, you don't see the stone bridge?" The monk said, "What is the stone bridge?" Jiaozhou said, "It lets asses cross. It lets horses cross." Asses like, donkeys. Let me read that again and I'll unpack it a little bit. A monk asked Jiaozhou, "For a long time, I've heard of the stone bridge of Jiaozhou. Now I come here, I just see a simple log bridge." Teacher said, "Oh, you just see the log bridge. You don't see the stone bridge." The monk said, "What is the stone bridge?" The teacher said, "It lets asses cross. It lets horses cross." So this thing about the stone bridge is because there was a famous ancient stone bridge nearby. Like ancient even back then. I don't remember when it was made, 500 BC or something like that. You build your stone bridge right, it sticks around, and apparently it's still there. I'd love to see it. And even back then it was like a tourist attraction. Go see this great stone bridge. It was called the Stone Bridge of Jiaozhou because this is the county of Jiao, the area of Jiao, and that gets us to another confusing aspect of these characters' names. Jiaozhou was not born Jiaozhou. He wasn't even named Jiaozhou when he ordained. He had different birth names and dharma names, ordination names. Like many Chan ancestors, he took the name of the mountain or the place where he ended up settling down. So he was the master of Jiaozhou. Shorthand, just call him Jiaozhou. I didn't even look up what his original name was because this is what we know him by now. And so this monk is actually giving him shit. And we assume it's a visiting monk, just arrived, I assume like with really nice clothes and nice pilgrimage gear, kept very clean, even after they would walk for weeks, to go from place to place. And says basically, I came expecting an impressive teacher. Like that impressive bridge. And now I get here, I just see this simple log bridge. And another famous thing about Jiaozhou is he chose to live pretty much in poverty. His robes were kind of falling apart, and he wrote a poem talking about how they were sort of smoke-stained and falling, like kind of tattered, His temple was pretty run down. There's a story that a chair broke, and rather than calling the carpenter, he grabbed a piece of half-burnt firewood and just lashed it to the chair to fix the broken chair leg. So yeah, he probably didn't look like much, And so the monk's comment here is a bit brazen and a little bit obnoxious. They did have manners, and you were especially supposed to respect your elders, even more so than with us. So it's kind of a shocking thing he would say that. But I love how Jiaozhou doesn't bat an eye, It's kind of the feeling I hear from this is, oh, that's what you see, huh? Okay. You just see the log bridge. You don't see the stone bridge? And somehow this composure and this steadiness of heart and non-reactivity, we would say, really shifts the monk's attitude, like immediately, He goes from arrogant to curious in a flash. And we know that because then he shifts from, complaining to actually asking a question, to actually being willing to learn. The monk asks, what is the stone bridge? What does it mean, to be impressive or not impressive, maybe you could say. It's always kind of been coded, these exchanges, there's a lot there. And Jiaozhou's answer, I think, is just so great, It lets asses cross, it lets horses cross. Like, this plain old log bridge works just fine. Stuff, it gets the job done. Animals, sentient beings, all beings can cross. And crossing, of course, is always a Buddhist metaphor for crossing over to awakening or nirvana. So it's a good thing to cross over. So as someone who never feels like I'm particularly impressive myself, I've always taken great comfort in this story, Like I'm happy to be a log bridge, Sometimes the bridge falls off, but I'm happy to be a log bridge. And And I have, as I'm sure you have too, I've had people tell me, "Well, you're nothing special. You're no good." They don't always say it outright, but our ego sensors are our ego senses are very attuned. Like, oh, guy doesn't like me, not impressed by me. They stop coming or whatever. And I can't say I've always had the steadiness of heart to say, "Oh, you just see the log bridge, you don't see the stone bridge, huh? Okay, see you later." See if they got curious. Maybe sometimes I do somehow. One last story. I know I'm supposed to stop now-ish. These are tight little hour you guys do. It's amazing. Because this is my second favorite story, and it has a fun little bit of Chinese in it. I'll explain it briefly. And it's important for us because we're about to sit zazen, if I remember correctly, because it's an exchange with Jiao about zazen. So we'll see if we can live into this right away. So a monk asked Jiao, "What is zazen?" Jiao answered, "It's not zazen." Another no, it's not zazen. The monk asks, "What is this not zazen?" And Jiao replied, "It's alive. It's alive." Isn't that wonderful? So may our zazen be alive, We're not sitting there doing a project or trying to figure things out or trying to be a Buddha statue, trying to be some new person, some new Zen, better person. We're trying to be alive, to really open to our aliveness. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's not any kind of aliveness, actually. It's a very vibrant, powerful aliveness. I did get a little geeking out around the Chinese as being translated as "it's alive." You can do that these days with online dictionaries and AI, even if you don't know anything about Chinese, And it turns out to be there is the character for life or alive, but then there's this doubled character pronounced bo. And bo is a complex, unusual character, hardly ever used, that means the sound of a fish's tail slapping the water. Like vigorous, loud, energetic, like fish. And with Chinese, right, you're making little characters, and so you have lots of little shapes to work from. So we only have 26 letters. They have thousands of characters. So you can come up with like a really specialized one like that, And you don't have to worry too much about a unique pronunciation. There's lots of homonyms. But people figure it out by the character, Probably even a Chinese person has to look this one up. So isn't that interesting to know that that's in there? It doesn't just say alive. It says alive like a slapping tail fish energy or something like that, that kind of aliveness. So maybe as you sit, you could feel your butt, like kind of energized in that kind of way. Isn't that fun? Who would have known, I got onto that because I read a book recently by Nelson Foster called Storehouse of Treasures, Recovering the Riches of Chan and Zen. And he doesn't talk about this one, but he talks about many other examples where we lose something in translation, right? The translator has to figure out what to do, and the translator's not going to say alive like a slapping fishtail, because we're going to be like, what? But isn't it fun to dig in a little bit and find out that that energy is implied, So that's Master Jiao. A little teeny bit about him. There's hundreds of stories, but they all have a similar kind of quality of steadiness and humility and use of language, just right there, right now. So I hope you feel maybe some little bit of resonance, or maybe you want to go meet him some more, which would be wonderful, or the other luminaries in our family tree. Aren't we lucky to have such great relations? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nomon Tim, for a wonderful talk. We're indeed going to sit for a few minutes, and I will ring us in and out. And after that, questions and answers.